Before disaster struck in 79 CE, Pompeii was not a symbol of tragedy. It was a living Roman city, prosperous and confident, resting near the Bay of Naples in what is now southern Italy. Its streets carried the sounds of commerce and conversation. Bakers rose before dawn to fire their ovens. Fullers cleaned and dyed cloth in busy workshops. Merchants negotiated prices beneath shaded porticos. Elegant villas, such as the Villa of the Mysteries, stood just beyond the city walls, decorated with vivid frescoes that still speak to us across 2 millennia. Pompeii was not isolated or provincial. It was woven into the economic and cultural fabric of the Roman world, connected by sea routes and roads to trade networks that stretched across the Mediterranean. The city owed much of its prosperity to the dark, fertile soil created by Mount Vesuvius. Vineyards and orchards flourished in the volcanic earth. Olive groves thrived. The mountain that dominated the skyline appeared generous rather than threatening. To the people who lived there, Vesuvius was simply part of the landscape, a silent presence that had shaped their fields and sustained their wealth. Yet the region was not without warning. In 62 CE, a powerful earthquake struck, damaging buildings throughout Pompeii and nearby towns. Repairs continued for years. Temples and houses were reinforced. Life resumed because in the Roman world earthquakes were not uncommon. By 79 CE, many residents had grown accustomed to tremors beneath their feet. Ancient sources and geological evidence indicate that small quakes were felt in the days leading up to the eruption, including frequent shocks about 4 days before the catastrophe. These movements did not trigger mass panic. They felt, to many, like a familiar inconvenience rather than a final alarm. There were also troubling signs on the slopes of Vesuvius. Later accounts mention that toxic emissions may have killed livestock grazing on the mountain. To modern readers, that detail feels ominous. To those living in Pompeii, however, such events were not clearly understood as volcanic warnings. The science to interpret them did not yet exist. When I reflect on Pompeii before the eruption, what strikes me most is its normalcy. This was not a city awaiting doom. It was a community planning festivals, conducting elections, repairing buildings, raising children, and investing in trade. The people of Pompeii were not careless or ignorant. They were human, and that ordinary confidence makes what followed all the more devastating. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in 79 CE, the calm above the Bay of Naples was broken by a sight so extraordinary that it would be recorded for history. From across the water at Misenum, Pliny the Younger observed a vast cloud rising above Mount Vesuvius. In a letter written years later to the historian Tacitus, he described it as resembling a pine tree, lifting upward in a tall trunk before spreading outward at the top. His account remains our most important eyewitness testimony. When I read his words, I am always struck by how carefully he tried to describe something no Roman had language for. He was watching a Plinian eruption unfold. Modern scientific analysis confirms that the column of gas, ash, and volcanic fragments rose to an astonishing height of approximately 34 kilometers. That is more than 3 times the cruising altitude of many commercial aircraft today. The force required to propel material that high speaks to the immense pressure building beneath the mountain. For those living in Pompeii, however, the danger was not measured in kilometers. It was measured in what began to fall from the sky. Within hours, pumice stones started raining down on the city. These were light, porous volcanic rocks, but falling in relentless quantities, they became deadly. For roughly 17 hours, the eruption column fluctuated yet remained sustained, feeding a continuous shower of debris. The stones clattered against rooftops and courtyards, collecting in streets and open spaces. As the hours passed, the accumulation grew deeper and heavier. Archaeological evidence shows that in some areas, the pumice layer eventually reached as much as 2.7 meters in thickness. Imagine standing in your own street and watching the ground slowly disappear beneath a rising tide of stone. Many residents attempted to shelter indoors, believing their walls would protect them. Yet the weight of the accumulating debris proved catastrophic. Roofs began to collapse under the strain, crushing those who had sought refuge beneath them. In this first phase, Pompeii was not yet consumed by fire or searing gas. It was being buried, slowly and relentlessly, beneath the very sky that had once seemed so ordinary. As evening settled over the Bay of Naples, the character of the eruption changed in a way that made the situation far more lethal. The steady fall of pumice was only the beginning. At approximately 7:06 p.m., according to modern reconstructions based on stratigraphic analysis and comparison with Pliny the Younger's timeline, the first pyroclastic current began to descend the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. This was not simply falling ash. It was a fast-moving, ground-hugging surge of superheated gas, volcanic particles, and fragmented rock. Over the course of the night, there were 17 distinct pulses of these destructive currents. Geological studies indicate that they occurred at intervals of roughly 80 minutes, each surge advancing, settling, and then followed by another. This rhythm is important. The destruction did not come as a single instant collapse. It came in waves, each one reshaping the landscape and tightening the trap around Pompeii and neighboring settlements. The temperatures within these currents reached several hundred degrees Celsius. At such heat, survival in direct exposure would have been impossible. The flows carried not only intense thermal energy but also suffocating concentrations of ash and toxic gases. The air itself became unbreathable. Visibility would have dropped to near darkness even before midnight fully arrived. Fine ash filled every space, entering lungs, coating skin, infiltrating homes that had already been weakened by the weight of pumice. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, described zigzag flashes and masses of flame appearing within the cloud. His words suggest electrical discharges generated within the ash plume, a phenomenon now understood as volcanic lightning. To a Roman observer with no knowledge of atmospheric charge separation, this would have looked apocalyptic. He admitted that he feared the world itself was perishing, and I find that reaction deeply human. Faced with darkness at midday, fire in the sky, and the ground trembling beneath one's feet, what else could it feel like? For those still inside Pompeii, the night offered no comfort. Each new pulse layered additional deposits across streets and buildings. Some currents may not have fully penetrated the city at first, but they marked an escalation that would soon become total. The eruption had moved beyond collapse of roofs and falling stone. It had entered a phase defined by speed, heat, and suffocation, and by dawn, the most devastating surge was still to come. By the time dawn approached on the second day, Pompeii had already endured hours of falling pumice and repeated nighttime surges. Some residents had taken shelter, others had attempted to flee during brief lulls in activity. There may have been a fragile hope that the worst had passed. But geological evidence tells us that the most lethal phase was still ahead. At approximately 7:07 a.m., the eruptive column above Mount Vesuvius finally became unstable and collapsed. When that towering pillar of ash and gas lost its structure, it generated a massive pyroclastic current that surged outward with devastating force. This was not a light ash cloud drifting on the wind. It was a dense, fast-moving avalanche of superheated gas, fine ash, and rock fragments racing across the landscape. In modern volcanology, events like this are understood as column collapse-driven flows, and in this case, the scale was extraordinary. This single current advanced across the plain for many kilometers. Scientific reconstructions indicate that the surge spread as far as 25 kilometers from the volcano, even striking the distant Laterri Mountains. Within Pompeii, it moved with a speed and temperature that left no realistic possibility of survival for those caught in the open. Temperatures in such flows are estimated to have reached several hundred degrees Celsius. The heat alone would have caused instantaneous fatal injury. The air within the surge was thick with ash and toxic gases, removing any chance of breathing. Archaeological layers show that approximately half of the victims discovered in Pompeii were entombed within deposits associated with this particular phase of the eruption. Many bodies were found in streets and open spaces, suggesting that people had attempted to escape when activity briefly appeared to subside. Instead, they encountered the deadliest surge of the entire sequence. When I think about that moment, what stays with me is not spectacle, but timing. It was morning. There was light. Decisions were being made in real time, under impossible uncertainty. The surge itself continued to affect the region for hours. For roughly 9 hours, eruptive activity remained intense, feeding currents that scoured the terrain and deepened the layers already covering the city. Buildings that had survived the night were overwhelmed. Streets disappeared beneath thick deposits of fine ash and debris. Pompeii was no longer a functioning urban space. It was becoming a sealed environment, its structures filled and immobilized. From a scientific perspective, survival within a dense pyroclastic current of this magnitude would have been impossible. The combination of extreme heat, high-velocity impact, and toxic atmosphere created conditions beyond human tolerance. This is not a dramatic exaggeration, but a conclusion supported by forensic and volcanological research. For me, this moment represents the true climax of the disaster. It was not the first falling stones, or even the terrifying flashes in the night sky. It was the sudden, overwhelming collapse at dawn that sealed the fate of thousands. In a matter of minutes, lives that had been unfolding only hours before were arrested and preserved in volcanic ash. And in that preservation, history itself was frozen. As the second day wore on, the violence of the eruption gradually began to diminish. After hours of sustained activity, the interaction between magma and groundwater increased the explosiveness for a time, generating finer ash and additional currents. Yet by the evening of the second day, the system was losing energy. At approximately 8:05 p.m., about 32 hours after the eruption had begun, Mount Vesuvius fell silent. The towering column collapsed for the last time. The ash cloud thinned. The ground stopped trembling. What remained was not a damaged city, but a buried one. Pompeii, and nearby Herculaneum, lay entombed beneath an immense blanket of volcanic material. In many areas, deposits reached depths of 6 to 7 meters. Streets, homes, temples, workshops, and gardens disappeared beneath layers of ash, pumice, and hardened debris. The scale of the eruption was extraordinary. Modern estimates suggest that nearly 8 cubic kilometers of volcanic material were expelled during the event. To put that into perspective, it is enough material to reshape an entire landscape. The human toll was devastating. Current archaeological findings indicate that roughly 2,000 people died within the first 24 hours, though the total number remains uncertain. Of the approximately 1,200 bodies excavated so far in Pompeii, many were discovered in streets and open spaces rather than inside buildings. This detail matters. It suggests that a significant number of residents attempted to flee during pauses in the eruption, only to be overtaken by the lethal surges of the morning. When I reflect on these final hours, what stands out is the abruptness of the ending. A city that had been alive with trade, conversation, and daily routine only a day before was now sealed beneath meters of stone and ash. There were no ruins to rebuild, no smoldering skyline to repair. There was silence, and beneath that silence, an entire community remained, preserved by catastrophe. For more than 15 centuries, Pompeii remained hidden beneath hardened ash and compacted debris. The world moved on. Empires rose and fell. Medieval villages formed and disappeared. All the while, an entire Roman city lay sealed below the surface, protected by the very material that had destroyed it. There were occasional accidental discoveries in the late 16th century during construction projects, but no sustained effort to uncover the site at that time. Pompeii was not yet understood for what it truly was. Systematic excavations began in 1748 under the Bourbon rulers of Naples. Early efforts were often driven by treasure hunting rather than careful archaeology, focusing on statues, frescoes, and valuable objects. Yet even in those early years, it became clear that something extraordinary had survived beneath the ash. Walls still stood. Paintings retained their color. Everyday objects remained where they had fallen. Unlike most ancient cities, Pompeii had not been rebuilt over. It had been frozen. A major turning point came in 1863 under the direction of Giuseppe Fiorelli. He introduced a technique that would transform the study of the site. Excavators had noticed hollow spaces within the hardened ash layers, voids created where human bodies had decomposed over time. Fiorelli carefully injected plaster into these cavities. When the surrounding ash was removed, detailed casts emerged, capturing the final positions and expressions of the victims. These forms were not artistic interpretations. They were physical impressions left by real people in their last moments. When I first learned about this method, I felt a profound shift in perspective. Pompeii was no longer just architecture and artifacts. It was personal. Through science and careful excavation, individuals who had been silent for nearly 2,000 years were given shape again, allowing us to confront the human reality of the disaster with clarity and respect. Today, Mount Vesuvius is not an extinct monument to the past. It remains one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world. The city of Naples lies only about 9 kilometers from its slopes, and the greater metropolitan area is home to roughly 3 million people. When we look at photographs of the mountain now, peaceful against the Italian sky, it is easy to forget that it is still classified as active. The landscape that once sustained Pompeii continues to support vineyards, towns, and modern infrastructure. The same geological forces are still present beneath the surface. What makes the study of the eruption of 79 CE so important is the level of detail researchers have been able to reconstruct. Through stratigraphy, forensic analysis, volcanology, and the preserved testimony of Pliny the Younger, scientists have built a remarkably precise timeline of events. We now understand that the disaster unfolded in phases, with an initial Plinian column, prolonged pumice fall, and then rhythmic pyroclastic currents, culminating in a catastrophic column collapse. This layered pattern provides crucial insight into how complex volcanic systems behave under pressure. For me, this transforms Pompeii from a distant tragedy into a living case study. It is not only about frescoes and ruins, it is about hazard assessment, evacuation planning, and public awareness. Modern civil protection agencies in Italy use the lessons of 79 CE to model potential future scenarios. Understanding the speed, reach, and thermal intensity of pyroclastic currents is not academic curiosity. It directly informs emergency planning for millions of residents. When I reflect on the entire story, I see Pompeii as both a preserved past and a warning. The detailed timeline of that eruption is more than an archaeological reconstruction. It is a reminder that natural systems can change rapidly, and that preparedness depends on learning from history with honesty and precision. The city that was buried has become a guide for the living. For me, Pompeii is not only a story of destruction, but a reminder of how fragile normal life can be. Researching this eruption changed the way I see both history and our present world. I would truly value your thoughts. Do you see Pompeii as tragedy, warning, or both? Join the conversation in the comments, and if this journey meant something to you, please subscribe to When History Broke so we can continue exploring the past together.